1970s. And this was a period in which the bankruptcies and business failure rates and unemployment was so high that they parallel those now. But it was solved through systematic inflation in all the advanced countries. This was not called the Great... each Great Depression, by the way, is called something different in the past in order to make it seem as if it's unique. And that's something that, again, we should avoid. There are unique elements to every recurrent event, but of course, there are also central elements. So then the question arises, what possible element could account for recurrence? So the term recurrence is very important to me, because if you understand that the system operates in a particular manner in which it overextends and then comes back down and falls much lower and then recovers and overextends, then the balance comes through turbulent regulation, not through equilibrium, but through successive overshooting and undershooting. And one of the patterns of this is the recurrence of cyclical patterns. We call these business cycles. There's 7-year cycles, there's a 10-year decennial cycle, there's a 20-year building construction cycle, but there are also longer patterns on the order of 30 to 40 years. And I don't mean to say that these are mechanically driven. They're driven by something deeper, which is, in my opinion, the dynamic of profitability. It should come at no surprise to the business people in this audience that what business is driven by is profitability. It's the economists that we have to persuade that is central point. And there it's always good to know that there are some economists who always know this. Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Malthus, Mill, and Keynes. Keynes especially emphasizes that investment is driven by two central variables: expected profitability, marginal efficiency of capital, which he points out is an expectational variable, because after all, a business, in order to produce something, has to make a decision in advance on what to produce. And what do they make that decision on? Not demand, on profitability. What's the difference? If I come and say, I will buy 1 million units of something that costs 10 pesos to make, and I'll buy them for 8, the proper answer, as any business person will tell you, is go away. Because it's a meaningless offer. You measure the demand by its effectiveness, and the effectiveness for business is profitability. That's an obvious point. The second point is that its profitability of a business has to be compared to the cost of capital, which is the interest rate. So what matters for the animal spirits of businesses is the excess of their expected profitability over the interest rate. Now this is very interesting, because this is the critical variable in classical theory for determining the regulation of the system. And it is in fact the critical variable in Keynes, not necessarily in Keynesian theory, but in Keynes for the regulation of investment. And I emphasize this because I believe these elements have always been there, and they need to be developed more formally, and I think they can be developed more formally to explain modern events. So let me just try and lay out my own explanation of the current crisis in terms of these elements. It's in a published paper, which I decided not to burden you with all the PowerPoint graphs, so I'm going to act them out where I need to, the central ones anyway. So if you look at the profit rate of the dominant capitalist country in the world, which is of course the United States at the present moment, then you'll see that the profit rate broadly drifts downward from 1941 with cycles, fluctuations, well known, associated with war, like the Vietnam War and budget deficits, but drifts down and then kind of stabilizes by around 1980 to 2000. Why does it stabilize after this long downward drift? Well, we know that that was the period where real wages were suppressed relative to productivity. And that suppression of real wage growth raises the profit rate. in a counterfactual way, if it were not for that, the profit rate would have continued declining. That is shown in my paper. But if you allow for the historical, very important historical reversal of the strength of labor in the advanced world, in England the same thing happened, then you get a stabilization of the profit rate. So that's one element. The great boom of the 1980s was a stabilization of the profit rate. The second element is that same period, in fact earlier than that, beginning in the 1980s, the interest rate was systematically lowered from 14% in the beginning of the 1980s all the way down to 1% now. Well, what does that do, a lowering of interest rates like that? It spurs real growth of the real system, because every business knows that if it can borrow at a lower interest rate, of course business, the prime rate is not the same thing as a base rate, but the point is that the interest rates all drift downward, makes it cheaper to borrow, so it spurs investment. This is Keynes's point. It's a very important point that it spurs the growth of the system, and I try to show in the paper concretely how this works, empirically. But the second thing is that a lower cost of capital spurs every kind of use of capital. Not just in the industrial sector, in the real sector so-called, but it also obviously spurs financialization of the system and the export of financial practices and capital from the center to the whole world. This becomes a foundation of neoliberal policy, but also neoliberal practice, this export of banking sectors, of stock market and financial speculation, as well as investment in housing in the United States, but also in Europe. Consumer borrowing in the advanced countries. All of these are greatly spurred by low interest rate. I myself have a mortgage, which was partially spurred by this, so I can speak to the fact that there are very concrete effects of being able to borrow cheaply. Not all countries have the same consequence from this, and one reason is that they have different regulatory structures. So this is a point that many people have made, Jamie made and others, that countries which were able to maintain some control over the use of financial activities, over speculation, over the separation of banking from speculative investment activities, fared better than countries who let that go. One of the countries that let go of that division, of course, was the US. But other countries like Canada were much more circumspect, and there were important insulational effects from keeping this division. So if you look at it from this point of view, then the boom of the 1980s in the advanced capitalist world was something that was bound to overextend, and the recurrence of a downturn was inevitable. As the governor mentioned, I worked for quite some time at the Levy Economics Institute on their macro modeling team, and my mentor was Win Godley, so I learned from the best. And Hyminski was also there, and we had many occasions to discuss these issues. So at a very concrete level, you can see these patterns developing. And if you go back and look at the writings of Godley and of the team itself before the crisis, you will see this reference to the buildup of unsustainable processes. When God especially emphasized that point again and again. So, in this systemic perspective, neoliberalism, which is something that for a while was viewed as the sign of the most advanced economic thinking, and now has become a kind of dirty word in many parts of the world, or justifiably so in my opinion. The idea there was not to attack the state, but to realign the state. To make the state shift away from emphasis on social concerns, shift away from perhaps an emphasis on local corrupt business concerns also, but to shift to opening up countries to the import of foreign practices and foreign capitals and foreign institutional structures and so on in order to make the system better. If you look in the writings of the World Bank and the IMF and the ILO, the mantra repeated again and again is that we are doing this for you. Because if you open up your countries to free trade and you open up countries to free import of capital, then your people will be better. And many countries under pressure have done that and have paid a price, but not all. Some have recognized from the start that this was a double-edged sword, and that yes, you can take advantage of the very powerful properties of markets, but you have to understand that markets have always been institutionally located, and that their outcomes depends on not only their intrinsic power, but also how they are channeled. China's